So we are tasked with the monumental topic of data and criminal justice. And we only have a few minutes to do that. I want to start by giving the audience a sense of, Amy and Laurie, your histories with criminal justice and data. And let's start with Amy. How was Measures for Justice founded? And what were your goals, and what's the process been since?
Measures for Justice was founded in 2011. I had just come off of the heels of writing a book called Ordinary Injustice about how the courts treat regular people, and the conclusion of the book says, look, we measure everything. We measure sports, healthcare, education, water supply, but we don't measure criminal justice. And in my book, there's all these stories of really, people, practitioners who have their hearts in the right place and they want to do the right thing, but they end up being a part of a system that causes enormous problems. For example, the prosecutor who has no idea, he's not prosecuted a domestic violence case in 21 years and asks, has it been that long? Or the public defender who pleads 48 people guilty in a day. So I founded this organization and said, can we collect data and create measures and then put it in a form so everybody could see it? And when we began, we got, a lot of people didn't think that you could do it. They're like, well, where's the data? How would you ever create measures? And it took us 5 years. And what we found is that there is a lot of data, and you can put it in a form. And all of our measures, we have 32 measures, and they go to 3 goals: fair process, fiscal responsibility, and public safety. And we launched last year. We made our data public, and it's with 6 states, 380 counties, and the greatest thing is that it's being used, and that you can filter the data. There's a filter function, and you can filter any of the measures by race, sex, indigent status, or type of crime. So this is really just version 1.0, and we've done 6 states, 380 counties, and we're going to be doing 20 states by 2020.
How are people reacting in those 6 states to increased transparency of the data in their system?
Well, we just had, it's not easy. Let me just tell you. Like, when we first began, I remember this one judge, we were in his office and we were showing him some of the early data, and he said, you can't compare 2 counties. And I said, well, why not? And he goes, well, one's an apple and one's an orange. And I just sat there, well, why can't you compare an apple and an orange? Why can't you say that one is red and smooth and the other is orange and bumpy, and then show the difference? And he looked at me and he goes, but I don't want a tomato in my fruit salad. And I think what he was saying was that, that basically, take your data and your messaging out of my state, is really what he was saying. But we didn't. We persisted. And we had a large victory, which is that a Florida legislator called us in November last year and said, look, we see that we have 21 of your 32 measures. Why don't we have more? So we went down to this legislator and we said, look, this is what you have. This is what you could have if you collected everything. So we collect not only courts, but prosecutor data, public defender data, sheriff data, Department of Corrections. And then what we do is we try and match the data, and we clean and code it and spend an enormous amount of time with people asking them why things are coded this way and how they are. And they were so excited. We presented the Florida Judiciary Committee, and you could just see them. We actually came on the heels of a presentation by the courts where they were showing how everything is impossible. And we're like, look, no, this is possible. Mm-hmm. And the Florida Judiciary unanimously passed it on to the Senate, and in first week of March, the governor signed into law that every county is collecting almost all of our data elements and putting it in a central place, which is huge. It is huge. And so we're now in the process of making sure that the Florida bill becomes a success. But I mean, but now, what's so interesting, and I know I'm going on a little bit, but what's so interesting is that it's gone from, you can't compare two counties, to, okay, now how do we compare among states? And how do we get all this data? How can we get more? And data breeds data. You put it out there, you try and make it as good or as perfect as you can, and people say, no, that's not right, or why don't we have more? And then it gathers momentum. And that's what's gonna happen here. And that's what's happening in this country, is people are like, criminal justice, it's a local problem right now, right? I mean, like, I don't know really what the White House is doing at this point, but it's a local problem. So let's fix our data, let's save money, let's make it safer. And the key to the whole thing was that we never pulled any punches, we kept it neutral, and I think it's Florida. I think it's going to be a domino effect of others joining.
And I want to ask you, Laurie, you were named, you were co-chair of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. Can you tell us what the goals of that task force were and how you went about meeting and examining those goals?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. First of all, I want to really congratulate Amy. The kind of work that she's done in really zeroing in on data at the local level, state level, yes, but at the local level. You know, criminal justice in this country is so decentralized. It's really a local enterprise. And that goes to your question, Vann, about the Obama Policing Task Force. The charge that President Obama gave to my co-chair, Chuck Ramsey, the police commissioner at that time in Philadelphia, and me, was that we look at how to build bridges between police and communities. And that was the central charge given to our task force. And we held hearings around the country, and this was all done, by the way, in 2 months. And we developed 59 recommendations and presented them to the president, and that was issued in the spring of 2015. And some central principles went to the issues of transparency and accountability. And data was a central feature of that. We said that it was really important for jurisdictions, for police agencies, to collect data and share it with the public, put it on their websites, to collect data on use of force, on officer-involved shootings, certainly on any lethal situations there, and to share data on a host of other things, certainly anything like deaths in custody, but also on arrests, on summonses, on a whole host of areas. We said that they should conduct surveys of citizens in their jurisdictions and do that on an annual basis, and to do it by census tract or zip code, so that you would find out how the differential was between areas of lower income and higher income. And so you would ask citizens, how are we doing? You would get that kind of feedback, and you would share that data and have a dialogue with your citizens so that you could really go about co-producing public safety. So data was a very important part of this report that came out.
So I want to point out this was initiated in the wake of Ferguson, right? And so
absolutely.
You had people across the country clamoring for any kind of data, not just on officer-involved shootings, but just the manner of policing in our communities. I remember actually some of the things people were doing to go and see how many people were arrested were looking through newspapers. They didn't have data at the level. What did we find from the task force, and how have perceptions, I think, among people of criminal justice data changed since then?
Yeah, well, I think that one thing that we need to step back and think about, again, is the fact about how decentralized the criminal justice system is in our country. If you look at the European systems, for example, Scotland Yard in England, for example, all of the police departments across the United Kingdom report up to Scotland Yard. So if they were changing their procedures, they can just issue an order and have all of the police departments get that order and, presumably salute and follow that. And we have 18,000 independent police departments in this country, each of them, and many departments represented here, of course, at this conference. Each of them is going to decide to do things in their own way. So during the course of the task force's work, and when we were meeting with the president, and he knew I headed the grants agency in the Justice Department, and he said to me, Laurie, why can't we condition the grants to require all of those police departments to send in information about officer-involved shootings that resulted in deaths? And he was really kind of pounding me a little bit on that. And you know, when the leader of the free world is pressing you, I don't get nervous very often, but you know, I swallowed pretty hard. And I thought, well, I headed that agency for 10 years. I think I know how it works. So I said, well, Mr. President, those really small agencies don't receive grants, and they certainly don't receive direct grants from the federal government. So there's no way to coerce them to send in that data. There's no way to condition a grant that they don't get. And in fact, the federal government doesn't have that leverage. So there's no way to do that. I think you know that the Guardian newspaper and the Washington Post, I think starting in 2015, yes, started collecting that data through news sources and other means, and have been doing it since that time. But the federal government, despite efforts through the FBI and the Bureau of Justice Statistics, has not yet officially from the federal level started releasing at least that data. But I think those efforts are going to continue to be underway. But it's an example of the limitations because of our decentralized system.
Beyond policing and thinking into all of the sectors of criminal justice, we're talking about courts, we're talking about lawyers, we're talking about prosecutors and corrections. What domain of criminal justice data collection is the most transparent and the furthest off? And where are we seeing the most opportunity for improvement? That's for you, Laurie.
You know, I think we need to step back for a moment and think about kind of the different layers. And in anticipation of this program, I was thinking back, I think the Uniform Crime Report that you see the FBI releasing every year, I think that started back in the 1920s or early 30s. And then you have to fast forward to 50 years ago with the President Johnson Crime Commission, which called for better collection of data. So that was a step forward and resulted in the creation of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which has set up, since the creation of that bureau back in the late 1960s, early 70s, regular issuance of statistics that all of you would be aware of, things like the issuance every year of the number of people on death row, number of people in correctional facilities every year, a number which has actually been going down for the last several years, number of people on probation and parole, and so on. So those state-level statistics are actually very good because those are easier to collect and quite reliable. But I think one thing that is really important, data can be very effective in influencing policy and have a real impact in different situations. For example, data analysis, which is something we haven't really talked about here, has been very influential in triggering the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which has helped in really resulting in more than half the states examining their prison and some jail populations, and resulted in lessening those populations by examining who's incarcerated. And many of the people who were incarcerated were individuals who perhaps could be moved to alternative settings because they were nonviolent drug offenders. And this has occurred, as many of you know, in red states, Georgia, Texas, Kansas, Arizona, as well as blue states, Hawaii, Rhode Island, and others. And that all really came forward because of analysis of data. Data analysis was really critical in that, in driving that.
Now, Amy, I want to ask you about another aspect of analysis, and that's, I think we're in a moment now when Americans are sort of skeptical of big data. There's been some pretty big stories in the news where there have been some unscrupulous data collection efforts. And people are sort of sounding the drumbeats on surveillance, on what happens if with facial recognition. So how are we thinking about ahead of, it's always difficult to come up with ethics ahead of time, but how are we thinking about good ethical frameworks for data collection and analysis that protect privacy?
First of all, that's an excellent question. It's one we've been thinking about our organization, you know, when Cambridge Analytica happens, you know, and, you know, Facebook and you start to think about, you know, is the public going to be thinking about the word data differently, right? You know, is this going to be a word that they're going to become inured to? And at the same time, this is really the only way. If, you know, in Florida there are, you know, tons of, how are you going to figure out with 67 counties what's going on? How are you going to answer the question of how are we doing? So it's a double-edged sword, and I think the answer is to respect privacy and to balance it at the same time as you gather the data, analyze the data, and put it forth. So at Measures for Justice, you know, we de-identify all our data. We would never single out a single defendant or a single victim. It's all aggregated when we produce it. And I think that's part of the answer, is to make sure that people's privacy, you know, is protected, and to work on that.
And I want to come back to you with one more question, Amy, but everybody in the room, get your questions ready. Amy, last question for you. When we're talking about this data conversation, a lot of the focus seems to be on administrative authorities, on states, on police departments. How can we think about data collection and the importance of data analysis in terms of individual autonomy and how it empowers people perhaps at the moment of contact with a police officer or through their journeys through the court system? How can we think about it that way?
Well, you know, so the court data, everything for all the data that we deal with, you know, from prosecutors and sheriffs, we are 30 years behind other public spheres, you know, and if we don't start using the data, seeing what's wrong with it, putting it out there, you know, you can't change what you can't see. And so what you have to do is put it out there, and then there's got to be some connective tissue between the neutral purveyor of data, which is us, and the people that use the data, and figure out that, yes, just like they have rallied to get better healthcare systems, and they have rallied to fix the water, and you know, they can do the same thing and use the data to say how they truly feel about their justice system, and say, this was the disparity rate today, I want a lower rate next time. That is how this change is going to happen, because justice happens on the local level.
All right, let's open up for questions.
Good afternoon, Roberta Myers from Legal Action Center. My question, Amy and I had a brief interaction, and we started talking about privacy, and instantly what came up was this issue of trust, and the public and communities being able to trust the collection of information, the use of information, and what kind of engagement needs to happen so that the community can kind of dictate also what kinds of information it needs to make things better and to hold officials and whomever accountable for how dollars are being spent to supposedly help or do whatever it was intended to do. So that's my question. How do we make sure community is a primary director about what information is collected? How do we begin to build more trust? Because especially in the African American community, we have a lot of distrust about sharing information that's going to be necessary to think about ways of improving systems. So that's my question.
Take it, Laurie?
Well, my recommendation would be that you have to be working directly with police agencies, and the police agencies should be reaching out to you to say, what information should we be collecting? What information do you want us to be collecting and sharing with you? In other words, that has to be an engagement to be deciding together what data should be collected and shared. And you should be right at the table in doing that.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, if you're a county executive and you get a call from a few people, in most of these places, that means a lot. And it just doesn't happen that much. So, I mean, grassroots, grass tops organizing to say what you want through the data.
Well, thank you, Amy and Laurie, for coming out, and thank you all for joining us.